Elizabeth and Mark decided to spend the weekend away from the city. They chose a small old inn located on the edge of the forest. The building was built in Victorian style, heavy wooden doors, massive staircases, and carpets that muffled the steps. The owner of the inn, an elderly woman with a sad look, met them at the threshold. "Welcome. I hope you enjoy our cozy corner," she said, handing over the keys. Their room was on the second floor. It was simple but cozy, with a large window overlooking the forest. The only thing that seemed strange was the neighboring door in the corridor. It was covered in strange scratches, and the lock looked unusually massive, as if they wanted to lock it forever. Before leaving, the owner warned, "If you hear a noise from this room, do not worry. Just do not open it, no matter what happens." Mark chuckled, finding it odd, but Elizabeth felt a little uneasy. "Well, what's there?" she asked. The landlady just shook her head. "It's none of your business, just leave it closed." The couple decided to ignore the warning, writing it off as an old man's eccentricity. But on the first night, they heard a strange noise. The night was dark and quiet, but Elizabeth and Mark's sleep was interrupted by a strange sound. There were footsteps, muffled and measured, as if someone was walking in the next room. Elizabeth woke up first. "Do you hear?" she whispered, pushing Mark. Mark opened his eyes and listened. The footsteps continued. They were heard just behind the wall, accompanied by a light creaking, as if someone was slowly running their fingers along the wooden panels. "It must be another guest," he muttered, turning over on his side. But at that moment, a quiet voice joined the footsteps. It was hers. "Elizabeth? Mark?" The voice sounded soft, but unnatural, as if several people were speaking at once. Elizabeth cringed with fear. "They know our names," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark could not bear it. He got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Elizabeth exclaimed. "I'm just going to take a look. They're probably some kind of prankster," he replied, trying to sound confident. He opened the door and walked to the room where the sounds were coming from. The lock was massive, but the door was slightly ajar, as if waiting to be pushed. Mark peered inside. The room was empty, a dusty place with bare walls and old furniture covered with sheets. "There's no one here," he said, turning to Elizabeth, who was watching him from the doorway of their room. But as soon as he stepped inside, the door slammed behind him. "Mark!" Elizabeth screamed, running to the door. But the handle wouldn't budge. Mark heard whispers inside the room. It seemed quiet, but it was coming from everywhere. "You shouldn't have come in," a voice rang out, now right behind him. Elizabeth desperately pulled at the door handle, pounded on it with her fists, but the door did not even budge. "Mark, can you hear me?" she screamed. But there was only silence in response. Inside the room, Mark stood motionless. Whispers surrounded him, growing louder, as if many voices were speaking at once. You came, you stay, you..." The words sounded like a song, drawing him into a strange numbness. Mark turned to the door, trying to open it, but the handle did not move. The old furniture around him began to change. Figures covered in sheets moved, revealing the outlines of people sitting beneath them. Their faces were empty, like dolls, but their eyes were black, infinitely deep. "I didn't..." Mark screamed, but his voice was gone. At that moment, the door suddenly swung open and Elizabeth rushed inside. "Mark!" Her voice echoed through the empty room. But Mark was gone. Only one of the figures at the table, now without a sheet, looked at her with a blank expression, and in its face she recognized the features of her husband. "No, it's not you," she whispered, stepping back. The whispers grew louder and the room began to fill with shadow. The voices reached out to Elizabeth, enveloping her. She felt her feet grow rooted to the floor, and her body became motionless, as if she herself was becoming part of this room. "You, too, will become one of us," the voices said. The next morning, the innkeeper noticed that the room was quiet again. She slowly walked to the locked door, ran her hand over the scratches, and sighed. Her pale skin radiated spring freshness. "It's too warm," she whispered, turning the massive key in the lock. Now Mark and Elizabeth were part of the room's history, their faces visible in the shadows on the walls. And at night, if you listened closely, you could hear whispers from behind the door, calling new names.